look, you can ask a million questions if you want to, but here are like the 15 things, the 5 things, the 2 things that really, really matter. Like, for example, how are we protecting phishing and emails, and how do we get them out of the email? How do we alert people that that's a phishing email? If we could just do that one thing, we would be a lot better off. And we know that we can do those things.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes, an Iron Scales podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with CISOs, security directors and architects, SOC analysts, and other InfoSec stars so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes. I'm your host for today's episode, Brendan Rudd, Community Director at IronScales, an email security platform powered by AI, enhanced by thousands of customer security teams, and built around detecting and removing threats in the inbox. We offer a service that is fast to deploy, easy to operate, and is unparalleled in the ability to stop all types of email threats, including advanced attacks like business email compromise, account takeover, and more. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into the show. Hey, Kirsten, welcome to the show.
Hello, it's great to be here. Brendan, how's you today?
Great. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. And I'm excited to talk about the cyber insurance market. But before we begin, would you mind telling us a little bit about you, your background, and what you're working on these days?
Yes, well, it's always a delight to have some time with you. At Cysurance, what we're doing is trying to create an integrated approach to cyber risk management and cyber insurance as it relates to cybersecurity. Lots of cybers in that statement, but it's really about this integrated approach that we know we need. And the way that we got here is, the way I got here, is through my supply chain risk management and financial risk management background. I joined cybersecurity almost 16 years ago now, and I saw this fundamental opportunity to do exactly what we just talked about, which is how do we actually bring technology and risk management together in a more effective way? We talk about people, process, and technology, and yet we don't still do a great job of bringing those three things together. And so as I worked in threat intelligence and running threat detection companies, I saw this opportunity to layer in insurance in a way that not only can we bring actionable insights to any size company, but also to help them get the right level of coverage for the long tail of if something goes wrong, which we know, especially recently it has been, that we can help people get rapid recovery, especially in the small and medium-sized business markets. Any downtime is too much downtime. So really trying to help people be effectively managing that risk and recovering as rapidly as possible.
Thanks. You brought something top of mind, which we hear a lot about lately, is like people, process, and what was the third thing you mentioned? Technology. So in your opinion, out of those three, have they all sort of incrementally improved over the years, or has only the technology improved and process and people gotten left behind? Because that's kind of how I see it. We're forgetting about the basics, which is people and process, but the technology is getting better. But if the processes and people are not using it correctly or understanding where to apply it, it's in vain, right?
Right. Well, and the results speak for themselves. And when we think about, and we'll talk more about the cyber insurance market, but that's exactly what we're seeing is the fact that the people and process elements have been left behind. It's resulting in losses and more attacks. And we think about still that the way that the hackers and bad guys are still getting at our companies is through people, right? And then we can have security awareness training and do other things, but we are always still talking about that weak link piece, which is the human element. And then, of course, there's the process piece. And you think about things like even wire fraud as an example. And one of the questions that insurance companies will ask is, do you have a process around dual authentication where two people approve a wire so that we can make sure that we can really limit those losses as much as possible? And people always answer yes, but in fact, they don't, right? And these are really simple things. And when we think about these things that we actually don't want to have happen to us, sometimes I'll even say this, provocatively, it's out of laziness, which it isn't really. It's just that people are always trying to move at the speed of business. And I think that also is what leaves technology behind. We're trying to run so fast that oftentimes we're considered the business prevention unit. And certainly, those kinds of processes, people feel like it slows them down. But then $200,000 goes out, and then that's really stressful for people. And so it's not that people don't care, but how do we help people implement that in such a way that it's effective, but doesn't slow them down so much that it creates an impediment to doing your job?
Why do you think we focus more on the technology versus people and process? Is it because it's cheaper? Is it because we're led to believe technology will save our problems? Like, what's the cause?
Well, I think it's a few things. I think a lot of it actually is organizational. I mean, if you think about people who sit in the security sphere of an organization, they're primarily driving implementation of technology. They're driving configurations. They're working with IT departments to make sure that everything is properly installed. It really is a technology-driven element of the business. And they're oftentimes not invited into the people side of the business. So, a chief information security officer or a security manager or those people, or even the IT departments, they're not invited into that conversation about, well, what processes should we have in place? They might run a security awareness training program or a training program around security awareness in general, but they're not really, I think, invited into the broader conversation of how business process is impacted by technology and technology impacted by business process. And I think that, that's something I've talked a lot about in terms of where that needs to be even a senior level, board level conversation, is how do we bring those points together to make sure that, as you say, the technology piece isn't completely bifurcated away, because those people just don't have that level of conversation to influence the overall business process or even understand how business process is working such that they can adjust their priorities from a technology perspective to manage that. And I do think that disconnect still strongly exists in organizations.
Let's take ransomware for an example. There are people and processes in place there that, to me, is directly connected to IT and info security teams. Like, for example, having backups, testing your backups. We still see this is not being done. So where is the lack of communication and where is the ball being dropped here? Because this, to me, sounds like an IT and info security people and process task or checklist item.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a great question. And I think sometimes it's prioritization and time. I mean, think about how many conversations you've had with IT security people where they're just like, oh my gosh, like my hair is on fire all the time, right? It's just like there's so much happening. And sometimes like the basic blocking and tackling gets left a little bit beside the road just because there are such immediate things on the fire. I mean, I think about just on a daily basis, the sort of like what we call our diet and exercise items that we should be doing for our businesses. And it's like, no, I've got to answer this email. I've got to do this thing. And then it's the end of the day. And I'm like, I really didn't take any time to think about this strategy. Right. And I think that's something that impacts all of us. And there's a lot of pressure on these people too, to get things done quickly. And yet at the end of the day, whether it's having a heart attack or having a ransom attack, it's like, oh gosh, if only I had done X, Y, or Z at the time. And it's trying to help get that prioritization in place. And certainly how insurance is now driving some of this conversation in cyber insurance with the changes around the attack profile that companies have and the rampant ransom attacks we've had in this last year is starting to push ahead the prioritization of some of these things because you have to prove it now. Yes, I have backups. Okay, prove it. Yes, I have MFA. We want to audit your environment. So now it's starting to come into alignment. What people say and what people do have to actually be verifiable, which I think is a good step forward just because it makes people slow down in order to kind of speed up on the other side. And sometimes, and we all need this, there are moments when we have to kind of be forced into, look, you have to do this now, and it's inconvenient, but it's just the way it is because it's important to be proactive in this moment.
I don't know, we just seem to prefer to work on autopilot versus taking time out to think and strategize. And I think that gets us into a lot of trouble. And I think it's a great segue into our conversation today about insurance. So with the rise of ransomware in the news, I thought it would be helpful for our audience to learn about cyber insurance and how to navigate the process. Would you mind, in layman's terms as much as possible, how does the cyber insurance market work?
Well, for a long time, the cyber insurance market was what we refer to as a soft market, meaning that it was readily available, that they were inexpensive, that you didn't have to prove much. So if you think about going and getting car insurance and you check a few boxes and a few things happen, but you can have car insurance in no time. Cyber insurance was a very similar process. And, it depended. There was a time when there was a pretty lengthy application process, and that scared a lot of people away. And certainly that's something that we at Cysurance have been focused on, is how do we make less friction in the process and make it easier for people, not necessarily to get it, but make it easier for them to get through the process. Because a lot of times, especially when you're looking at the small and medium-sized businesses, there are lots of answers that they don't have. They just don't understand the questions to begin with. And so, as you say, and speaking in layman's terms, how do we make sure that we can get people appropriately protected, but also that they know how to answer these questions and meaningfully participate in the process? Because the insurance process should be that this is the God forbid conversation, right? It's like all the bad things have happened, and so now we have insurance. The challenge with cyber insurance is that it's really kind of sat in front of all the other risks. And so we have 3,000 plus security companies in the world. As you said, the silver bullet kind of, well, why isn't the technology working? Yet cyber insurance has been intended for a long time to kind of sit in front, and people really weren't implementing the right controls. And so the way it's working now is that the market is very hard, like literally almost overnight. It's almost like the stock market now, where day by day, it's like, is there any available capacity? Meaning, is there enough money out in the marketplace for people to even bind policies? And the shift has happened so fast because of these ransom attacks in particular, some wire fraud, and certainly this period, this COVID period, where we've had distributed networking, and we talk about all of the stresses on our IT teams. These things have come together to create a really challenging market from the cyber insurance perspective and cybersecurity. So now the burden is shifting back to the security controls, the security teams, because they really have to prove now. You can't just check a bunch of boxes and say yes. And goodness, we know that for all the time we've had this conversation in cybersecurity, whether it's related to compliance or an attestation, we always say you can't just check a box and make us all secure. It doesn't work, right? So we know that's true. It's being proven yet again. And so now it's looking at, how do we get the right controls in place? And where the cybersecurity market can really influence this is that now when I see some of these questionnaires, particularly for high risk categories, where that would be healthcare or the managed service providers who have very high risk environments, these attestations or these questionnaires might be 6 pages, and then they get a ransomware questionnaire that's another 4 pages. And I look at these questions and it's like, do these things actually really matter? I mean, I can tell you some of them do, some of them don't, but it's become kind of the cover yourself sort of questionnaire, as opposed to, are we meaningfully helping companies get better, get safer, reduce impact? The whole point of this is reduce impact. Nobody wants this to happen. And if it does happen, they want it to go away as fast as possible. That's the end, right? And so that's really where I think the security community can come back into a line and say, look, you can ask a million questions if you want to, but here are like the 15 things, the 5 things, the 2 things that really, really matter. Like, for example, how are we protecting phishing and emails, and how do we get them out of the email? How do we alert people that that's a phishing email? If we could just do that one thing, we would be a lot better off. And we know that we can do those things. And so those are the elements where I think the security community, who often will say, hey, just put us into the panel for being incident responders on an insurance company or sell our product. We as a community need to be much better at telling our companies, our small and medium-sized businesses particularly, here are the 3 things you can do that were like your cyber seatbelt, right? If you wear the seatbelt, you're going to be okay in a car crash. And I think that's really where we need to start.
Yeah, thanks. That was really insightful. And I want to go back for a second. You mentioned that the insurance market changed overnight. So how was it previously to get insurance before, like you said, it changed overnight? What are the main differences in getting insurance nowadays?
Well, it was check the box for 5 questions. Do you have backups? Are you compliant? Do you follow your state laws? Do you have processes around wiring money or invoicing? Do you verify that someone's changed a routing number for a bank account if you get a new invoice? That's it. Sign your name. Congratulations. Here's $1 million worth of coverage. And so we all got really good, especially in the insurtech world, really developing those platforms to make it very simple to acquire a policy. Now, what we have to do is get the technology piece. And we have some of these technologies that give risk scores and other things by looking at external environments of your network. I personally don't think it's enough. For those of us in security, we know that internal network scans are more effective. We have a much better view of what controls really are in place. That's a direction we are going to have to go, much like people have apps in their cars that monitor and measure how they drive, and they get discounts for that. The first step for us isn't going to be discounting. It's going to be you qualify. You can actually have this coverage, and we're going to continue to check that you're doing these things. And then perhaps down the road, when we really have a better understanding of how effective they are, that's when discounting will come into play.
Previously, we spoke about the different types of markets. You mentioned there were 2 different markets. Can you break those down and explain for our audience?
Right. So there's the general marketplace that for normal organizations, and then there's the marketplace for companies like managed service providers and technology providers, particularly. And that marketplace is locked up in general right now. It's very difficult, and I feel very badly for our compatriots who are in the technology space, because obviously these have been areas where, in the one-to-many supply chain attacks, they've been the ones most impacted. And so getting coverage for them has been very, very challenging. And so we try to work with them to develop alternative types of alternative risk models, alternative risk products that can give them some level of coverage and help them qualify for insurance. And then there's the general marketplace, which is also under a lot of pressure. We look at premiums having increased 50% over the last 4 or 5 months. They're continuing. We are looking at ransoms. The ransom demands are increasing really substantially. They have had in 2021. So, now we're starting to see impacts where they're now sublimating, which means that if you have $1 million policy, they might only give you $100,000 of coverage for ransom/extortion type coverages. So the market is trying to react a lot. And that's the challenge with insurance in general, is it's very reactive, because it can't be anything more than reactive, because it starts to look at losses and then now what do we do? And so again, for us, it's like really thinking about how we can proactively start to move that needle back, because we will not get improvements in these types of situations until we can start to show them that proactively and with data that we're being more effective in preventing things from happening.
And in terms of the main players in the cyber insurance market, who are the big insurance players and what are the options available for cyber insurance?
Well, they're the names that you would know. I mean, there's Chubb and there's AIG and Beasley. And so those are some of the big insurers that we're seeing. Even Geico, like the Berkshire Hathaway Group, is starting to have different products. We have what we call MGAs, which are managed general agencies. Those are companies like Coalition or Corvus or Dual. So there are many flavors and stripes of different organizations that are providing cyber insurance. And all of them are starting to develop new ways to measure risk. And the measurement piece, I think, is really the interesting component, because everyone's trying to do it in a slightly different way to really understand how can we benchmark? And we know this in cyber in general, which is we've been trying to get benchmarking for a long, long time, right? So it just depends on how you come at it. Now, the analysts will tell you in general that they think this benchmarking capability, especially for cyber insurance, is still in its really young state. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think for us as a community to really start thinking about holistically how we get to that better benchmarking is how we will get more effective in not only helping people set the proper controls, but also start to make it so that we can actually measure it in a way that's more effective.
Yeah, it feels like the more people sign up for cyber insurance, the better your benchmarking will become. So it's just a matter of time so you can see who are the best example companies and start trying to make your model based off of lots of data.
It's true. And one of the things, and we've talked about this even in respect to some of the products you have in your environment, is being able to show the negative piece, right? Because our biggest challenge in our industry writ large is how do we prove the negative? If it didn't happen, like if I don't have a ransom attack, is it because I'm lucky, because it hasn't happened yet and they're already in my network, or because we actually prevented it from happening? And so the more that we can start to pull data and share that data with the community, but also with the insurers of we're actually stopping this much from happening. We can prove that to you. And so then we can get to this is the claims activity. The challenge is that the insurance world only has claims activity. So we know that someone got hit. We know they filed a claim. We know we have 1 million insureds. 100 of them got hit. There's the number. But what we don't know is, I kind of called our traffic pattern sort of measurement of insurance, because for car insurance, we think about how many cars are on the road, how many cars are in an intersection, how dangerous is the intersection, such that they can be pretty predictive and who's going to have a car crash, where are you going to have a car crash? And we need to have that level of data, but we have to be able to see how many people are passing through an intersection, how many times they actually have an accident in the intersection. And those are the things that we have to be more forthcoming with in our industry to actually give up that data.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I would also add that you have two factors, the external factors and the internal factors. So the external factors is what you were talking about now, the intersection, how many cars on the road, versus the internal, which is the individual or the company. What's your record? How many times have you had speeding tickets, or how many times have you hit someone or crashed, et cetera, et cetera?
Exactly. And so right now, like to the question of how do people acquire cyber insurance, a lot of it is based on revenue and sector of your organization, which we know may or may not be the right indicator, right? I mean, we also know that a certain person of a certain age and a gender may have a proclivity towards having more or less in terms of accidents in a car. It's a similar thing where they're profiling, but they're profiling mostly based on that's the clue to whether they're on the right maturity curve of their cyber awareness. And those things aren't necessarily in alignment. It's like we talk a lot about a florist or a bakery. You could be a $50 million florist. Do you have the same level of risk as someone who's like a $10 million, fund manager? But we also know that people are targeted. They may not be targeted. Someone clicks on a link. I mean, so it's like sometimes it's somewhat arbitrary, but just because you have more revenue in your organization or you're a florist doesn't necessarily mean that it's causal, that you may have higher or lower risk.
Cybersecurity Heroes is brought to you by IronScales, an AI-powered, self-learning email security platform that helps security professionals proactively prevent, detect, and remediate phishing attacks in a matter of seconds, not hours or days. And we have an exclusive offer for our podcast listeners. Discover dormant phishing threats in your organization's mailboxes. Get a free 90-day scan back with a detailed report. Integrate in seconds with 2 clicks via API to Microsoft Office 365 and see what your current email security is missing. Go to ironscales.com/free scan to learn more.
You mentioned that the industry is still maturing and everyone's trying to figure out best how to assess risk. Can you break down for our audience some of the questions being asked now of companies before they can get insurance?
Well, one of the big ones is around multi-factor authentication. And this one already stumps a lot of people because, especially if you have complex network environments or you have hybrid on-premise cloud environments, because there are lots of cloud environments that every one of those different pieces of your environment has its own control for its own MFA. Then you have access into email and other things. And so part of the challenge has been why these have become more and more granular in these questionnaires is, do you have MFA? And everyone throws up their hands and goes, well, yeah, but what do you mean? So now they have to go down to do you have multi-factor authentication for servers? Do you have multi-factor authentication for devices? And on and on and on and on. And so, and again, that's where we need as an industry to help the insurance world get more clarity on, well, does it matter? Yes, probably. But if you had to answer one question, is it on your email server? Probably a really important question. They ask that around personal devices as well. So that's one that gets thorny really fast, and how we really have to help definitionally help people get through those questions. Backups are another one. They want distributed backups that are offline at some point. But many backups now don't need to be offline because they're mirrored and replicated multiple times, so that if there is a ransom attack, they have multiple copies in different places. So perhaps that isn't necessary anymore. So part of it's the evolution of technology. To your earlier point, how do we keep pace with the questions we're asking? Because some of those controls may have been really important even a year and a half ago, that now we might be able to do it differently and more efficiently. And so those are some of the disconnects and things where people, that's why they get stuck and go, I'm not even turning in this thing because I can't even get through it, because it depends, right? This is the worst part of insurance for everybody. You ask a question and the answer only definitively is, well, it depends. It depends on your revenue. It depends if it's offline. It depends. And we have to do a lot better at that.
Does that mean if you can't answer the question or check all the boxes, you're not eligible? Or does it just mean it's going to be more expensive versus a much cheaper plan if you could have checked all the boxes?
A little bit of both. It depends. But it does actually a little bit. But let's use, I have an example that I had one just the other day from a managed service provider. And it was strange because I got a notice back from multiple insurance carriers saying security controls aren't nearly effective enough, just pure decline across the board. When we finally got an underwriter, and then an underwriter's like, look, there are 4 things where, they just click no. And I was looking at this form, I was going over the form, and there were these drop-down boxes, and oddly, the drop-down boxes defaulted back to no when that's not actually what they clicked originally. So I don't know that, so it was a weird PDF issue. And so we had to go back and actually do screenshots of the original form, because in that instance, it was like, they just don't have enough in place for us to even authorize us to issue a policy. We got that fixed. And so there were still a couple of issues where they were like, we're concerned about this, so now the price is higher. But many instances now, if you can't appropriately answer, especially the MFA question and some of the firewall questions affirmatively, it's just no. Because they just know that the likelihood becomes so high that they can't insure that risk.
And you touched on an interesting point there. It sounded like there is a market similar to how you would get home insurance or car insurance. You can work with brokers. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. So what is the kind of pros and cons of working with a cyber insurance broker?
Well, they're referred to as cyber specialists, and then there's the more general broker population. The nice thing with cyber specialists is they have a much better view and understanding of requirements. There are a lot of brokers who are afraid of these cyber questionnaires and the coverage, sometimes because there's a concern that with cyber coverage, everyone's trying to find a way to not pay a claim. And so a lot of brokers don't want to put their clients in a position where they would pay this premium and then get a decline of coverage when something bad happens. So there's a lack of trust there, and the insurance world has trust issues to begin with. So that's an area where people are worried. The other is just that there's a level of complexity where, again, these questionnaires become so complex that if you aren't fairly technical, you can't possibly get through them. And so that's part of where, like in our own model, we distribute through managed service providers and security technology providers, because our belief is that they own the infrastructure and so can help certify and help people understand what actually is in that environment. So that's the way we've tried to solve for that problem. And then there are others who work very closely with the insurance companies, like a Coalition or Corvus, where they have their own risk management controls that they check for, so that they can help support the brokers in that conversation so that they don't have to be so technical. So there are kind of a few ways to bite at that apple, but mostly it's for people who are really more specialized in this space, much like many others like healthcare or other more complex type coverages where you need to understand the ins and outs to make recommendations and support your client base.
Is the insurance market evolving pretty rapidly, like on a monthly to quarterly basis now with all these attacks happening?
I would say it's even more frequently. I mean, I'm seeing changes in forms, like questionnaire forms, and even forms as in like the policy documents themselves. They're changing. Some of them are changing monthly, a little bit more frequently. You'll see some bad thing happens in a Broadway and you'll see another question pop on the bottom. So really it's the questionnaires that are changing quickly. I do know that several of the very large insurers have come together to have discussions around supply chain attacks and their willingness to cover systemic losses. So those are the ones that we think of that are like really persistent across technology providers like, say, SolarWinds or kind of the Microsoft type events, where they're just saying the risk is so great that we just can't possibly insure against that. And that will have, I think, some impact in the marketplace, because at that point, how do people protect against catastrophic risk? And we don't have an answer for that question right now.
What is your differentiator when it comes to insurance? Because you mentioned the big players and then the brokers and the specialists. So where do you fit into this marketplace?
Well, we have a couple, but the most important one for us is where we have shifted to a service guarantee product with the security providers and the service providers. And our belief is that we're trying to help support organizations who have really effective products, a lot like in managed detection and response, or managed service providers who manage the entirety of the environment. And so we can actually certify controls, and we have a service guarantee that we have in place that actually gives a customer of theirs some level of guaranteed coverage, almost like a warranty, you could think of it. And that goes in place so that when we're able to then write a cyber liability policy on top of it, we can actually checkbox those controls and manage them with our insurance carriers, because we already understand the environment. So we're trying to draw a strong linkage between really understanding environment and warranting that environment is effective, because we also believe that if we can get our arms around that, we can really reduce impact. And that's the key. The key to reducing the losses is to reduce impact, which is good for everyone. And we're hoping that then that combination with integration into insurance allows us to then reduce the pressure that insurance companies are in carrying the entirety of that weight, and trying to get much lower cost type events in place where we can then support that and then really have these as catastrophic policies on the cyber liability side.
Earlier in the conversation, I remember you saying your typical insurance company will just want to check the boxes and cover themselves versus actually helping the customer become better. So would you say that you fall into the bucket of trying to make your customers better, stronger, because obviously that benefits both you, the insurer, and the customer? It's a symbiotic outcome for success.
Absolutely. And really it's part of my long-term thesis of being in this industry, which is really trying to help link the efficacy of solution to the risk management portion of it. And helping the providers show what they can do and demonstrate what they can do to effectively help mitigate risk. I do find it fairly amazing that in our time, with all of these different security vendors, and I know you've heard them say, I have the magic bullet. We solve all problems. It's like, then why do we have this problem? And I think that we do need to shift the burden back to the security industry to say, prove it, and we'll help you prove it, and we'll help you show that to the insurance industry. But it's really incumbent, I think, upon the security providers now to show that they are doing things that are protecting customers, and customers need to know that too, because it's a very scary time for people. And more now than ever, we are relying on this infrastructure to power our companies. It is everything. Everyone needs the internet now, and more people are on the internet than driving cars. So, we need to appropriately adjust for that.
In terms of putting your feelers out there looking for a cyber insurance vendor partner, what are some questions companies should ask when evaluating cyber insurance companies?
Well, the key things are the important coverages that one would think about, obviously, right? Ransom protection. There's a big debate. Does the fact that we actually cover for ransoms facilitate ransom, right? And I would say my answer is no, because that would be like robbing a bank, or there are all analogies that you could drive to that same question. That it's evolving, right? Cyber risk is evolving, and we think about how it was 5 years ago, and remember Zeus was a big deal, and keystroke loggers, and they still are, but something takes its place, and that's the thing we have to be most aware of, is that this is evolving risk, and this is what makes it challenging for this market in general, the insurance market. Insurance markets aren't really geared towards evolving risk, but we can see that in other categories when we look at wildfires and hurricanes and other things where it's very difficult now to predict and manage them in the way that they used to do such things. And so those are the areas where we need to be the most focused.
What are some common mistakes that buyers make when choosing cyber insurance?
Price. Obviously, it's difficult when you think about other policies you buy. They're often so uniform that price really can be the primary driver. What people are finding is that they are just missing really important coverage. Wire fraud is a big one. When people talk a lot about insurance policies not paying on the cyber side, it's because a lot of them just didn't have the right coverages in place, and they thought they did. And so it's a really key thing to look at that. And also the third party. And third party risks are things that are outside of your organization. So using the car crash analogy, it's the other car, right, that you crashed into, and their damages and losses. And this is a really important coverage piece, because if something goes wrong and one of your customers or one of your vendors is impacted, you want to make sure that your policy will help support the financial protection for them as well. And those are really some of the key things that I see missing when I'm reviewing policies, is to make sure that they're getting the right levels of coverage, and that it's what's not in there. Read the exclusions page first. That matters more probably than what's included.
Could you talk a little bit to the pricing model for insurance? Is it more affordable? Is there any high-level pricing that you could talk to? I know it obviously depends, but maybe just 3 sort of general examples or common examples for SMB, mid-market, and enterprise companies wanting insurance?
Yes, if you're a small company, and by small I mean less than $5 million in annual revenue, you're looking for $1 million worth of coverage somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,000 a year, give or take a few $100, right? And that would include cybercrime coverage, which includes social engineering around wire fraud, invoice fraud. So, that pricing is going up a little bit, but, you might cap out at $1,500 in that range. When you are getting to be a mid-market company, you are going to enter into the 5-digit realm. So you can be anywhere between probably $14,000 to $20,000, depending on the size of your organization. And then if you start, like, not even for enterprise, but sort of mid-tier, 100 million, 200 million annual revenues, you're going to be pushing 50 to 100,000 a year. So they start to creep up pretty quickly. And then, when you're in an enterprise realm, the big challenge for that group has been around dealing with what they call towers, because you have to have so much coverage. You need like $30 million, $40 million worth of coverage, that the insurance companies are actually cutting those in half so that you can't even really get that much coverage. So that the market is really peaking out at that area where it's getting very difficult to get the appropriate level of coverage.
And you spoke about price hikes, where do you see the cybersecurity insurance market going in the near future with all the ransomware attacks? Do you foresee just prices rising all the time?
Well, my guess is we're going to hit a point where they just can't raise prices anymore. I mean, you can, but at some point, it's the point of diminishing returns, right? And so I think that will start to hit a threshold, and what will then occur is the reduction of coverage. And we're already seeing that, where most policies, where if you had $1 million policy, you had $1 million worth of ransomware coverage. Now it's $1 million policy, we'll give you $100,000 of ransomware coverage. So what they're trying to do is sublimit, as it's called, to start to do that around some of the high impact risks, and then leave the normal sort of aggregate, the total value of the policy the same. The other thing to be aware of that's something that is somewhat new, but becoming more and more relevant to this space, is that also cyber policies have coverage for non-malicious types of events. So power outages that cause business interruption losses. And so things like deleted data or servers that go down. And so this is really important just to consider when you're thinking about like disaster recovery, business continuity, and how you're managing that portion. Cyber policies are really effective at also providing coverages around your digital environment for disaster recovery, just in general, as we start to look more and more at the impacts of different natural disasters that we're experiencing. It's good to know that these coverages exist for your infrastructure and these types of policies as well that are very useful.
For companies that are thinking about taking out insurance, maybe after this podcast, what would you advise them on doing to perhaps prepare for the audit that comes? Like, how long does it take?
Well, there are a number of compliance programs now that can help with the application process, especially now that the questionnaires are getting to be much longer. So you can run your system through one of those programs, and it can actually evaluate your network and answer those questions for you. And so there are more and more of these programs becoming available for companies, and I think that's very useful. And also, if there are sort of network control or audit control type programs where you can certify your environment, they'll request one, but if you can provide it to your insurer, that will also help. The more proof that we can have in place for them, the easier it's going to be. And certainly, for a lot of people, especially in the small and mid-market, they work with managed service providers. So they can also provide assistance, especially because there is a lot that one might not know about the environment just in terms of cloud infrastructure. So seeking advice from your IT service provider can also limit the time that it takes to get through it.
As we wrap up here today, is there anything else you would like to add that we may have missed, or any final thoughts?
Well, I regard this as an opportunity. It feels very challenging at this time, but I do think, as I said earlier, that it's really an opportunity for us as a community, a vendor community, to realign, especially the marketing messages around supporting our customer base and looking at how we really help to define what we're preventing as much as we are defining what's happening on the outside around us. And I think that the more that we can speak to our ability to show that data and show people what we can do to support them in this process, the better. I think for a lot of small companies in particular, they just don't buy these products, not because they don't want them or don't see a value to it, but because they just don't know what to do. And I think that we as an industry need to simplify a little bit and help people across all maturity curves really understand, if you have to do just 3 things, 2 things, 1 thing, do this, do that, do the other thing. I think that would help a lot for everybody, because it's really, we're in the protection business, and that's what I think where we need to start.
Awesome. And in terms of your services, your company, would you like to just give us a quick final pitch on what you do and how you can help anyone who's listening who may be interested in reaching out to you?
Yes, I mean, certainly we work with service providers, IT service providers, and then security product companies. We'd love to talk about the programs and products you have in place to figure out if we can offer a service guarantee program and then help them get larger insurance policies and really close that risk management loop. And that's what we're here to do, and to help support all of our vendor community to be more effective in solving these problems and helping their customers be safe and reducing impact. That's really the key. Impact reduction and how we can help support that.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for taking the time to join us today. If anybody would like to reach out to you, where's the best place to connect with you?
You can go to Cysurance.com.
Are you active on LinkedIn? Because we usually also throw out LinkedIn LinkedIn requests here as well.
Yes. So Kirsten Bay, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me, CEO of Cysurance.
I hope that wasn't from peer pressure. I'm just kidding.
No. I'm still bad at social media. It's kind of embarrassing, but I'm trying to get better.
It's another added benefit of coming onto the show.
That's right. Thank you.
So thank you again so much for taking the time to join us on Cybersecurity Heroes, and to the rest of you, we'll see you next time.
My great pleasure. Thanks, Brendan, for having me.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.